unemployed corporate strategist with a mortgage I couldn't afford and a marriage hanging by designer threads. Now, I was Ethan Grant, holder of a $25 million consulting contract and apparently the biggest fool in suburban Chicago. Jesus Christ, Marissa. The words came out flat, emotionless, like I was commenting on the weather. She didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed. Charles Benton, CEO of Meridian Industries and the man who'd fired me 3 weeks ago, scrambled for his silk boxers like a teenager caught by parents. My wife just pulled the Egyptian cotton sheets up to her collarbone and stared at me with those ice blue eyes that had once made me forget my own name. Ethan, her voice was steady, controlled. We need to talk. Do we? I set the champagne bottle on the dresser next to her jewelry, the Cartier watch I'd bought her for our anniversary, the diamond earrings from her parents, and now, apparently a new tennis bracelet I definitely hadn't purchased. Because it looks like you've been doing plenty of talking without me. Charles finally found his voice along with his pants. Look, Grant, this isn't what it looks like? I laughed, and it sounded harsh even to me. It looks like my wife is screwing the man who destroyed my career. So, unless there's some other interpretation I'm missing, I think we're all clear on what this is. The front door chimed downstairs. Of course, because my day wasn't complete without Marissa's parents arriving for their weekly inspection of our lives. I could hear Eleanor Stanton's voice drifting up the stairs, sharp and disapproving as always. Marissa? Darling, why is Ethan's car in the driveway? Doesn't he have interviews to attend? Marissa's face didn't change, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes. They don't know you're here, she said to Charles. This is perfect, I muttered. Absolutely perfect. Charles was fully dressed now, straightening his tie like he was heading into a board meeting instead of sneaking out of my bedroom. Ethan, let's be adults about this. What do you want? What did I want? 3 weeks ago, I'd wanted my job back. This morning, I'd wanted to celebrate landing the biggest contract of my career. An hour ago, I'd wanted to share champagne with my wife and tell her we were finally going to be okay. Now, I wanted to watch both of them burn. I want you to leave, I said quietly. Both of you can figure out how to explain this to the Stantons. Ethan, Marissa started. No, I held up my hand. I'm done with the explanations, the excuses, the pretending. You want Charles? You can have him, but you don't get to keep me as backup while you figure it out. I turned to leave, but Charles's voice stopped me. The contract, Grant, the Meridian consulting deal. You might want to think about how this affects your future. I looked back at him, this man who'd fired me for restructuring and was now threatening me from my own bedroom. Are you seriously trying to blackmail me right now, while you're still wearing my wife's lipstick? His hand went instinctively to his mouth, and I felt a grim satisfaction watching him realize his mistake. The contract's with Meridian Industries, Charles, not with you personally, and last I checked, the board wasn't thrilled with your leadership lately. I smiled, and it felt like broken glass. But please, keep threatening me. I'm sure Eleanor Stanton would love to hear about your negotiation tactics. I walked out, leaving them to figure out their exit strategy. Downstairs, Eleanor and Richard Stanton were examining my living room like crime scene investigators. Eleanor's silver hair was pulled back in its usual severe bun, her Chanel suit immaculate despite the Chicago humidity. Richard stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, radiating the kind of old-money disapproval that had made me feel inadequate for 8 years of marriage. Ethan. Eleanor's greeting was arctic. Still unemployed, I see. Actually, I just landed a major contract. $25 million over 3 years. I kept my voice pleasant, professional. Consulting work with Meridian Industries. Richard turned from the window. Meridian? Isn't that where you used to work before the unpleasantness? The unpleasantness. Like getting fired was a minor social faux pas instead of a career-ending catastrophe. That's right. Turns out they need my expertise after all. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. How convenient. And where is Marissa? We were supposed to have lunch. Before I could answer, footsteps on the stairs announced my wife's descent. She'd changed into a sundress and fixed her makeup, but there was still something disheveled about her, something guilty. Mother? Daddy? She kissed them both, the picture of filial devotion. I'm so sorry, I was taking a nap. In the middle of the day? Eleanor's disapproval could have frozen Lake Michigan. Really, darling, you need to maintain some standards. If only she knew what standards were being maintained upstairs. Where's your car, Ethan? Richard asked suddenly. I saw it in the driveway, but there's another one in the garage. Expensive looking. My jaw clenched. Charles's Porsche. Of course, he'd parked in my garage like he owned the place. "A friend stopped by," Marissa said quickly. "He's using our bathroom. He'll be down in a moment." Right on cue, Charles appeared at the top of the stairs. He'd composed himself, smoothed his silver hair, and put on his CEO mask. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted between me and the Stantons. "Eleanor! Richard!" His voice boomed with false bonhomie. "What a pleasant surprise!" Eleanor's face transformed. The Ice Queen melted into social butterfly mode, all smiles and air kisses. "Charles, how lovely to see you. What brings you to our children's home?" "Our children." Like Marissa and I were still teenagers playing house. "Business, actually." Charles shot me a look that could have cut steel. "Ethan and I were discussing a potential consulting arrangement. Very promising." "How wonderful." Eleanor clapped her hands together. "Finally, someone recognizes Ethan's potential." The way she said it made it clear she thought my potential was severely limited. But Charles Benton believing in me? That was different. That was validation from someone who mattered in their world. "Yes," Charles continued, warming to his performance. "Ethan has some unique insights that could be very valuable to Meridian. Of course, these arrangements require a certain level of discretion, trust." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Play along or lose the contract. I looked at my wife, standing between her parents and her lover, and felt something cold settle in my chest. She met my eyes for just a moment, and I saw it all there. The calculation, the certainty that I would fold, that I needed this contract too much to rock the boat. She was right, of course. 3 weeks ago, she would have been absolutely right, but that was before I'd spent 21 days eating ramen and watching our savings evaporate. Before I'd swallowed my pride and called every contact I had, begging for work. Before I'd finally caught a break with this contract, only to come home and find my wife celebrating with the man who'd tried to destroy me. "You're absolutely right, Charles," I said slowly. "Trust is everything in business. And discretion." I smiled at Eleanor and Richard. "I'm sure you'll both be very discreet about Charles's visit today. Wouldn't want the wrong people getting the wrong idea about why the CEO of Meridian Industries spends his afternoons in our bedroom." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Richard's face went through several interesting color changes. Marissa looked like she wanted to disappear into the hardwood floors. Charles, to his credit, kept his composure. "Ethan, I think you are overwrought. Perhaps we should discuss this later when you've had time to think clearly." "Oh, I'm thinking very clearly." I picked up the champagne bottle from where I'd left it on the side table. Dom Perignon, $200 I couldn't afford, bought to celebrate a contract that was now hanging by a thread. In fact, I've never seen things more clearly in my life. I walked to the front door and opened it wide. "Charles, thank you for stopping by. I'm sure you have other appointments to keep." He straightened his tie one more time, nodded to the Stantons, and walked past me without another word. But as he reached the threshold, he leaned in close enough that only I could hear. "This isn't over, Grant. You have no idea what you're playing with." I watched his Porsche disappear down Maple Street, then turned back to face the wreckage of my living room. Eleanor and Richard looked like they'd been hit by a truck. Marissa stood frozen in the middle of the room, her perfect composure finally cracking. "Well," I said cheerfully, "this has been fun, but I have some calls to make. Contract negotiations, you understand?" I headed for the stairs, leaving them to sort out the pieces. Behind me, I heard Eleanor's voice, sharp with panic. "Marissa, what is he talking about? What bedroom? What was Charles doing upstairs?" But I was already climbing toward my office, my mind racing with possibilities. Charles thought he held all the cards because he controlled the contract. The Stantons thought I was still the same desperate man who'd married their daughter for love and stayed for fear. They were all wrong. I had 25 million reasons to play this game differently now, and unlike them, I had nothing left to lose. My phone buzzed as I reached the top of the stairs. A text from an unknown number. "Business and pleasure, Ethan. You should try both. CB." I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it, but not before screenshotting it first. Game on, Charles. Game on. The Meridian Industries Charity Gala was the kind of event where Chicago's elite gathered to write tax-deductible checks and pretend they cared about underprivileged children. Black tie required, compassion optional. Under normal circumstances, I would have avoided it like the plague. But the consulting contract had a social clause. Attendance at key company events was mandatory for relationship building and brand alignment. Corporate speak for "dance for your supper, monkey." I adjusted my rented tuxedo and surveyed the ballroom of the Drake Hotel. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables that cost more per plate than most people made in a week. The guest list read like a who's who of Chicago power brokers, politicians, CEOs, old money families who'd been running the city since before the Great Fire. And somewhere in this sea of designer gowns and practiced smiles were my wife and her lover, probably planning my professional funeral. Ethan Grant? I turned to find a woman in her 50s approaching, champagne flute in hand and a predatory smile on her lips. Margaret Holloway, society reporter for Chicago Magazine, the kind of journalist who could make or break reputations with a well-placed paragraph. Margaret, lovely to see you. I summoned my best networking smile. Wonderful turnout tonight. Indeed. Though I have to say I was surprised to see your name on the guest list, given recent developments. Her eyes gleamed with malicious curiosity. I heard through the grapevine that you and Meridian had parted ways. Temporarily. I'm actually back in a consulting capacity. New contract, new opportunities. I kept my voice level, professional. Sometimes a fresh perspective is exactly what a company needs. How fascinating. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. And how does Marissa feel about you working with Charles Benton again? I imagine that creates some interesting dynamics at home. The question hit like a punch to the gut, but I managed to keep smiling. Margaret Holloway didn't ask random questions. She knew something or suspected something and was fishing for confirmation. Marissa's always been supportive of my career. She understands that business is business. Of course. Margaret's smile sharpened. Well, speak of the devil. I followed her gaze across the ballroom and felt my stomach drop. Marissa had just entered, her arm linked through Charles's like they were arriving at their own wedding. She wore a stunning red gown that hugged every curve, a dress I'd never seen before and definitely hadn't paid for. Charles was resplendent in a custom tuxedo, his silver hair perfectly styled, looking every inch the powerful CEO. They were beautiful together, confident. They belonged in this world in a way I never had and never would. The conversations around us died as heads turned to track their progress across the room. I caught fragments of whispered commentary. Stunning together, don't you think? Heard he's getting divorced? Poor Ethan Grant must be devastating. Margaret Holloway was watching my face with the intensity of a scientist observing a lab rat. Interesting, she murmured. Very interesting indeed. Before I could respond, disaster struck in the form of Jeremy Walsh, one of Marissa's country club friends, and a man who'd never liked me even when my marriage was solid. He approached with the swagger of someone who'd had too much champagne and not enough sense. Ethan, didn't expect to see you here tonight. His voice carried across the immediate area, drawing attention. Thought you'd be home updating your resume. Jeremy, I nodded politely. Always a pleasure. I bet it is. He grinned, clearly enjoying himself. Must be tough, watching your wife move up in the world while you're, well, wherever you are these days. The conversations around us had stopped entirely now. Margaret Holloway was practically vibrating with excitement, no doubt already composing her article in her head. This was exactly the kind of scene that would be dissected in society columns for weeks. Actually, I'm doing quite well. New consulting contract with Meridian Industries. Very lucrative. I kept my voice calm, but I could feel heat rising in my cheeks. Consulting? Jeremy laughed, loud and ugly. Is that what we're calling it now? Because from where I stand, it looks more like charity. That's when it happened. Jeremy, gesturing expansively with his champagne flute, accidentally stumbled into me. The champagne went everywhere. Down the front of my rented tuxedo, onto my shoes, splashing onto the marble floor. Oh, no! Jeremy's mock concern was Oscar-worthy. I'm so sorry, Ethan. How clumsy of me. The laughter that followed was like glass breaking. Not loud, not obvious, but sharp and cutting. The kind of refined cruelty that Chicago high society had perfected over generations. I stood there, dripping champagne and dignity, while Jeremy smirked and Margaret Holloway took mental notes for her column. Across the room, I caught sight of Marissa watching the scene unfold. Her face showed the perfect amount of concern, enough to look sympathetic, not enough to actually help. Charles was beside her, his hand on her lower back in a gesture that was both possessive and protective. He said something in her ear that made her smile, and I realized with crystal clarity that they were enjoying this. My humiliation was entertainment for them. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. The voice that cut through the ballroom chatter belonged to Victor Lane, former CEO of Meridian Industries and the man Charles Benton had ousted in a boardroom coup 2 years ago. He stood at the podium, distinguished in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, commanding the room with the kind of presence that came from decades of corporate warfare. What was he doing here? I know you're all eager to hear about tonight's charitable cause, but first, I'd like to make a special announcement about Meridian Industries' exciting new consulting partnership. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't part of the program. As many of you know, Meridian has been undergoing significant changes in recent months. New leadership, new strategies, new challenges. Victor's eyes found Charles across the room, and his smile was razor sharp. Which is why I'm so pleased to announce that my consulting firm, Lane Strategic Solutions, has entered into a partnership with one of Chicago's most innovative corporate strategists. He gestured toward me, and suddenly every eye in the ballroom was focused on my champagne-soaked form. Ethan Grant brings a unique perspective to corporate restructuring, the perspective of someone who's seen organizations from both the inside and the outside. His insights into Meridian's operational challenges have been illuminating. The room was dead silent. I could see Charles's face from across the ballroom, and he looked like he'd been hit by a truck. Marissa's perfect composure had cracked, confusion and something that might have been fear flickering in her eyes. Victor continued, his voice carrying easily across the stunned crowd. In fact, Mr. Grant's analysis of certain irregularities in Meridian's recent financial reports has been so thorough that we've decided to present our findings to the board next week. Irregularities, financial reports, board presentation, holy crap. Victor Lane wasn't just making a social announcement, he was declaring war on Charles Benton, and he'd somehow made me his tool of choice. But enough business talk, Victor said smoothly. Tonight is about charity, after all. Please enjoy the evening. The conversations resumed, but the energy in the room had shifted completely. I was no longer the pathetic ex-employee being humiliated by Jeremy Walsh. I was Victor Lane's partner, armed with information that could destroy Charles Benton. Margaret Holloway appeared at my elbow like a shark scenting weakness. Well, this is a fascinating development. I don't suppose you'd care to comment on these irregularities Mr. Lane mentioned? Before I could answer, Victor himself materialized beside us. Up close, he was even more imposing, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from winning more battles than you'd lost. Margaret, always a pleasure. I hope you'll forgive me if I steal Mr. Grant away. We have some urgent matters to discuss. He guided me away from the reporter and toward a quiet corner of the ballroom, his hand firm on my shoulder. Victor Lane, he said, extending his hand. I believe we have some mutual interests to discuss. Ethan Grant. And I have to say, your timing is impeccable. Victor's smile was cold and predatory. I've been watching the situation at Meridian with great interest. Charles Benton has made some questionable decisions since taking over my position. Decisions that have created opportunities for those willing to act on them. And you think I'm willing to act. I think you're a man who's been pushed too far by people who underestimated you. Victor's eyes flicked toward where Charles and Marissa stood, now surrounded by concerned board members asking uncomfortable questions. I think you're ready to push back. He was right, of course. 3 weeks ago, I would have taken Jeremy's champagne bath and slunk home with my tail between my legs. I would have accepted Charles's affair with my wife as just another way the universe had decided to screw me over. But that was before I'd spent 21 days eating ramen and contemplating bankruptcy. Before I'd clawed my way back from professional death, only to find my wife celebrating with my executioner. Before I'd realized that sometimes the only way to win a rigged game is to flip the table. What did you have in mind? I asked. Victor's smile widened. Why don't we discuss it over dinner tomorrow night? I think you'll find my proposal very motivating. Across the ballroom, Marissa was making her way toward us, her face a mask of controlled panic. Charles was right behind her, his CEO swagger replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. Ethan, Marissa's voice was honey over steel. We need to talk. Do we? I looked her up and down, taking in the expensive dress, the new jewelry, the perfectly applied makeup. Because it seems like you've been talking plenty without me. Don't be childish. This is important. You're right. It is important. I turned to Victor. Dinner tomorrow sounds perfect. Should I bring anything? Financial records, perhaps? Internal memos? The color drained from Charles's face. Grant, you're making a serious mistake. Am I? I looked around the ballroom at all the faces watching our little drama unfold. Because from where I stand, it looks like I'm finally making the right choices. Marissa stepped closer, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. Ethan, please, you don't understand what you're doing. Charles can destroy you. He can make sure you never work in this city again. Can he? I smiled, and it felt like the first genuine expression I'd worn all evening. Because it seems to me that Charles has bigger problems to worry about than my career. I looked at my wife, really looked at her, and felt something cold and final settle in my chest. The woman I'd loved for 8 years, the woman I'd built my life around, was standing in a ballroom full of Chicago's elite, begging me to protect the man she'd been screwing behind my back. You made your choice, Marissa. In our bedroom, with my boss, in our bed. Now I'm making mine. I turned to Victor. Tomorrow night it is. And Victor, I have a feeling this is going to be a very productive partnership. As I walked away, I heard Marissa calling my name, heard Charles's voice raised in what sounded like barely controlled panic. But I didn't look back. I had a war to plan. Victor Lane's penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a Gold Coast high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Lake Michigan. The decor was understated but expensive, the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself because everyone already knew it was there. I sat in a leather chair that probably cost more than my car, nursing a glass of scotch that was older than my marriage, while Victor outlined his proposal. Charles Benton is a competent manager, Victor was saying, but he's not a visionary. More importantly, he's not as careful as he should be with other people's money. Embezzlement? I asked. Nothing so crude, but creative accounting, questionable expense reports, some very interesting consulting fees paid to companies that exist only on paper. Victor smiled. The kind of thing that looks perfectly legal until someone starts asking the right questions. I leaned back in my chair, processing the implications. And you want me to ask those questions? I want you to do what you do best. Analyze corporate structures and find inefficiencies. The fact that those inefficiencies happen to involve Charles Benton is just serendipitous. Through the windows, Chicago spread out below us like a circuit board, all lights and connections and hidden pathways. Somewhere down there, Marissa was probably having dinner with Charles, planning their next move. The thought should have hurt more than it did. What's in it for you? I asked. Besides revenge. Victor's laugh was dry. Revenge is a young man's game, Ethan. I'm interested in justice. Charles destroyed my reputation to get my job. He convinced the board I was too old, too set in my ways, unable to adapt to changing markets. Then he proceeded to run my company into the ground. Your company? I built Meridian from nothing. 30 years of my life, my vision, my relationships. Charles inherited an empire and turned it into his personal playground. Victor's voice was calm, but I could hear the steel underneath. I want it back. My phone buzzed with a text message. Marissa, we need to talk. This is bigger than you think. I showed Victor the message. He read it and smiled. She's not wrong. This is much bigger than a simple marital dispute. Victor refilled my scotch. Charles has been using Meridian resources to fund his lifestyle and your wife's. The jewelry, the clothes, the trips to Napa Valley last month that she told you were spa weekends with her girlfriends. You've been watching them. I've been watching Charles. Your wife is just collateral intelligence. Victor's expression softened slightly. I'm sorry, Ethan. I know this can't be easy. It wasn't easy, but it was clarifying. Every lie, every excuse, every time Marissa had made me feel like I wasn't good enough, it all made sense now. She hadn't fallen out of love with me. She'd traded up. So what's the plan? I asked. Victor pulled out a tablet and showed me a series of financial reports. Charles has been very creative with expense accounts. Private jet flights to client meetings that were actually romantic getaways. Hotel suites charged to executive training that were used for personal entertainment. Jewelry purchases classified as corporate gifts. I scrolled through the documents, my corporate strategist brain automatically cataloging the irregularities. It was elegant in its simplicity, nothing technically illegal, but ethically questionable enough to destroy Charles's reputation if it became public. The board would have to act on this, I said. The board would have no choice. Meridian is a publicly traded company. Shareholders don't appreciate executives who treat the corporate treasury like their personal piggy bank. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from Jules Morrison, my best friend and the only person who'd stood by me through the divorce proceedings. Jules was an ex-cop turned private investigator, which made him useful for situations exactly like this one. "I need to take this," I told Victor. "Ethan." Jules's voice was tight. "We have a problem. I've been doing that background check you asked for on Charles Benton, and I found something you need to see." "What kind of something?" "The kind that explains why your wife's been acting so strange lately. Can you meet me at Murphy's in an hour?" Murphy's Tavern was the kind of dive bar where cops and ex-cops went to drink away their disappointments. Jules was already there when I arrived, hunched over a beer in a corner booth with a manila folder spread out in front of him. "Tell me," I said, sliding into the opposite seat. Jules opened the folder and pulled out a series of photographs. "I've been following Charles and Marissa for the past week, like you asked. Most of it was what you'd expect: fancy restaurants, hotel rooms, shopping trips. But then I saw this." He handed me a photograph taken with a long lens. Charles and Marissa were sitting in his Porsche outside a medical building, and Marissa was crying. "Gynecologist's office," Jules said quietly. "She was in there for 2 hours. The implications hit me like a physical blow. She's pregnant. That would be my guess. And, given the timeline..." Jules shrugged. "Well, you haven't been living together for 3 weeks." I stared at the photograph, trying to process what this meant. Marissa was carrying Charles's child. My wife, my soon-to-be ex-wife, was going to have a baby with the man who'd destroyed my career. "There's more," Jules said. He pulled out another set of documents. "Financial records. Marissa's been moving money out of your joint accounts and into a private account Charles set up for her. She's been planning this for months, Ethan. The affair, the pregnancy, the financial arrangements. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing." I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. Not anger, exactly. More like clarity. For weeks, I'd been telling myself that Marissa had made a mistake, that she'd been seduced by Charles's power and money, but still loved me somewhere deep down. But this wasn't a mistake. This was a calculated betrayal, planned and executed with the precision of a corporate takeover. "What do you want to do?" Jules asked. I thought about Victor's offer, about the financial records that could destroy Charles's career. I thought about Marissa, pregnant with another man's child while still legally married to me. I thought about Jeremy Walsh's champagne bath and Margaret Holloway's predatory smile and all the ways Chicago's elite had made it clear I didn't belong in their world. "I want to burn it all down," I said. Jules grinned. "Now you're talking. What do you need?" "Everything. Financial records, phone logs, hotel receipts, credit card statements. I want to know every lie they've told, every dollar they've stolen, every law they've bent." I finished my beer and stood up. "And Jules, I want it all documented. Photographed, recorded, legally admissible. Going to court? Maybe. But first, I'm going to give them a chance to do the right thing." I smiled, and it felt like broken glass. "I'm going to offer them a deal they can't refuse." Back at Victor's penthouse, I found him reviewing the Meridian financial reports with the intensity of a general planning a battle. "How did your meeting go?" he asked. "Productively. My wife is pregnant with Charles's child, and they've been stealing from our joint accounts to fund their new life together." Victor looked up from his tablet. "That complicates things." "Does it? Because from where I sit, it simplifies them considerably." I poured myself another scotch. "They've made their choice. Now we make ours." "What did you have in mind?" I pulled out my phone and showed Victor the photographs Jules had given me. "Charles has been using company resources for personal expenses. Marissa has been stealing from our joint accounts. They're both vulnerable to exposure. You want to blackmail them." "I want to offer them a choice. Charles can resign quietly and make restitution to Meridian, and Marissa can agree to a clean divorce with no alimony claims. In exchange, their secrets stay private." Victor considered this. "And if they refuse, then we go public with everything. The financial irregularities, the affair, the pregnancy, the theft. We let Margaret Holloway and her colleagues tear them apart in the society pages while the SEC investigates Meridian's books." "That would destroy them both." "Yes," I said. "It would." Victor was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. "You've changed, Ethan. 3 weeks ago, you were a desperate man begging for work. Now you're talking about destroying 2 people's lives with the calm of a corporate executioner." He was right. 3 weeks ago, I would have been horrified by what I was planning. I would have taken the high road, filed for divorce quietly, and tried to rebuild my life without hurting anyone else. But that was before I'd learned that mercy was weakness in Chicago's elite circles. Before I'd discovered that playing fair was just another way of saying you were willing to lose. They made me into this, I said. Charles fired me to clear the way for his affair with my wife. Marissa married me for stability and traded me in for a better model when one became available. They both counted on me being too decent, too weak, too afraid to fight back. I raised my scotch in a mock toast. Here's to proving them wrong. Victor smiled and raised his own glass. To justice, then, however it needs to be served. We drank, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The old Ethan Grant, the one who'd played by the rules and trusted in fairness and believed that good things happen to good people, was gone. In his place was someone harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Someone who was about to teach Chicago's elite that there were consequences for treating people like disposable assets. The war was about to begin.